Okay.
One, a two, a one, two, three, boom. What? What's so funny?
I don't know. Are you ready to start the Bearded Bible Brother band, or you want to do an episode?
Yes. I think
Okay.
we should rap a book of the Bible. I think we should hip hop a book of the Bible. We should bluegrass a book of the Bible. We should opera a book of the Bible.
Okay. Well, with that said, without further ado, it's the Bearded Bible Brother.
Welcome to Bearded Bible Brothers. We're here to talk about Joel. Really? You're going to count down while you're laughing super hard?
I don't have nothing else.
Oh, man.
Okay.
Welcome to Bearded Bible Brothers. I am your bearded host, Matt, and today we are jumping into the book of Joel. But first, how are you, Josiah?
You know what? I'm doing good. I am doing very well. Joel and I are just finishing up a week of hanging out together while mom and sister were hanging out together in Kansas. And yeah, we've done a marathon of Star Trek Enterprise.
Nice.
Yeah.
So
we're
is that why you decided that when we were talking back and forth about doing one of the minor prophets, is that why you decided on Joel? Because you were spending time with Joel all week?
Yeah, I guess so.
It's a good
Kinda
book,
makes
and it's a good name to have named your son. Well done, sir.
Yes. And you know, it's interesting how that name got involved in our lives. It was completely by accident.
Really?
Yeah. We had just so we were on our honeymoon. We went to San Francisco, and this was 13 years ago. So this was back in 2010. And we just got back from an outing, and she lays down on the bed. I'm heading to the bathroom, and we had not been talking about kids, but all of a sudden Joel came out of her mouth, and we both
You're
stopped.
like, no, Josiah. This is kind of awkward.
Well, I had that thought when I was younger, and you know what? Name a kid. I even thought of going Junior, Josiah Marshall Jr. But when she said Joel, we both knew that's going to be the name of our firstborn son. But what happened is that we weren't planning to have kids for a while. We were going to wait a few years, and just enjoy hanging out with each other.
Yeah.
But shortly into our marriage, we found that she had something called endometriosis, and she had to have surgery to get a lot of it removed. Now, the doctor, who was apparently a pioneer in that area, looked at us and said, okay, so she has a chance now of actually getting pregnant, because before she didn't, he said. But now she's got a chance. But here's the thing. You got a 1 to 7% chance of getting pregnant within a 1-year window.
Wow.
It's like, okay, no pressure.
Right.
And for that entire year, we were very distracted that entire year with this thinking, because we're going, oh, we don't really want to do this yet. But anyways, after that year was over, we're still hemming and hawing. And she was sitting at work one day, and she felt impressed that to go look up the name Joel. Now, I don't know what source she used, but she found that one variation could be the Lord is willing. And so when that meaning was presented to her, she goes, well, God, if you're willing, then I'm willing. And she called me and says, what do you think? Well, I'm willing too. Let's do this. We got pregnant within the first month.
Wow.
And our son has been an absolute blessing. Granted, all kids have their moments. All kids have their ways. But it really was kind of fascinating how Joel came into our lives. Now, that's not exactly what the name Joel means, especially among scholars. But you know what? It definitely served a purpose for us being able to appreciate the opportunity that God was giving us earlier than we expected. And it's been absolutely wonderful. I could not be more thankful and for him and the opportunity to be his daddy, which I'm sure you could say the same thing about your boy.
I could, but I'll save that at some point when we do the book of Daniel.
Sounds great.
His namesake.
Sounds great. Now, as I understand it, you've done a little bit more study on this book. I've kind of put myself through a small little crash course in this thing. And one of the things that I was looking into just even last night, I was laying in bed reading through this, was several features. One was the age of the book. One was the timeline of the book. And even the origins of the book in some ways.
Okay.
But one of the things I was met with one commentator was that that one possible suggestion as to when this book was written was based on the how it was placed into the Tanakh in the Jewish, chronological order. They supposedly, from what I was reading, the Tanakh puts a chronological order on the writings and the prophets, and as a result, we can take that to mean this is when it was written. That it was beginning. As a matter of fact, I even marked it. It said that beginning with Hosea, the 12. So the minor prophets, the 12, conforms to the historical periods of the prophets, beginning with Hosea and Amos from the mid 8th century BCE and concluding with Haggai, Zechariah, and Malachi from the late 6th. What do you think of that? Do you think that could really be could that be the solution to all of these crying out loud. The amount of speculation out there when this book was written was just staggering.
It really is.
Unbelievable.
Yeah. I've always preferred the older dating of the book of Joel. Mm-hmm. It just makes more sense with how it's laid out. Some of the other prophets, whether major or minor, well, sections of the major and then the minor ones, are very obvious because they hardly make mention of the northern kingdom of Israel or Samaria.
I was noticing that too. Yes.
And so the ones that are written primarily to Judea, mm-hmm. the assumption is very easy to make that it's because the northern kingdom has already been taken over by the Assyrians. Mm. And the prophets are speaking to the southern kingdom saying, hey, this is going to happen to you if you don't do the same, if you don't shape up. And Ezekiel wrote along very similar lines. And I think chapters 16 and 17, he says, learn from your sister who is no more, mm-hmm. Speaking to Judea. But I think Joel, I've always preferred the dating being earlier. And personally, I think that it was, it's much, much older than a lot of the other minor prophets, but that's just me.
Okay. Well, you know what? That was intriguing because there was one suggestion that it came around the reign of Joash, because that the enemies that are mentioned, Philistines, the Phoenicians, Egypt, and Edom, are consistent with that date of around 9th century BC.
Okay.
Because there's even a lack of mention of the Assyrians or Babylonians, who were the main enemies of Judah during the 8th, 7th, and 6th centuries.
Yeah.
So, I mean, that would really even make some sense that it would at least be between the 9th century and at least 4th century. But then again, that's while that's quite a broad spectrum of years.
Well, sure.
And then there was even one other guy, a rabbi that I was listening to, and he was talking about Jehoram and how there was some famines that took place during his time reign, and that the discussion of locusts, which I'm sure we'll get into today, that could actually reflect part of that time period and the issues of famine that they were having. more of a
Could be.
literal approach, but I would say, as he even said, a plausible approach, given that there are just so many other approaches to this book. But definitely interesting to say the least. I've had, even when I was in seminary, I remember doing some dating on some books just based on placement words and all that jazz. But it's still just so amazing to see the myriad of ideas that people have had over the centuries about this book and other books over time. But would you think, I'm curious, do you think that it's absolutely necessary to really know when this book was written, but rather that it was written?
Yeah, no, I think dating any book of the Bible is an interesting exercise, but not at all necessary to understand what the book is saying and generally who it's saying it to. So, yeah.
Well, one of the things I always want to point out before jumping into a minor prophet is to, especially when I was doing it in more of the evangelical circles, was to point out the fact that the word minor isn't to make it any less important. Right. But that it's the reason they call minor is based on the length of the books. But one of the reasons why I've come to really enjoy reading the 12 minor prophets is that there's this general theme that seems to unite them that concerns Israel's relationship with God. It's constant throughout. And it gives a lot of, oh my word, it's just so much information at once, but then at the same time, you get so many varied pictures of this relationship with God and how God's looking at it. You got to, I won't go into all of them, but you've got the aspect of marriage, you've got the aspect of feasts, you've got it covers so many gamuts of what was established back in the Torah, and how this has all fallen short, and the call to come back to Him. Now, in reading Joel, just even this first chapter. Oh, you know what? Before we go into that, let me ask you one other question. So when I was looking into Petuel, his daddy, Joel's daddy, I came across some interesting things. One of which was the suggestion that Petuel was one of the sons of Samuel. Really? You heard that? Yeah.
I've never dug into who he was, so I have nothing really to contribute, but that's really interesting and could be a cool tie-in.
It could be. Now the commentator really tried to point out the fact that even though Samuel's sons completely kind of went, they really screwed up, that this was a firstborn, that God had somehow redeemed by calling him into the Navi. What do you think of that thinking?
Sorry, that which one is the firstborn? That Pethuel?
Petuel was the firstborn of Samuel.
It's possible.
It's possible, but I mean, what purpose does that serve? To place him into that position? I don't know. It's just some random thoughts that came into my head, because I mean, it's not something I've ever thought to really attach Petuel to, was the prophet Samuel.
And sometimes the ancient Jewish sages and rabbis would draw connections like that are meant to be not literal the way we think of literal in the West, but literal as far as like developing a line of credibility, even if they're not biologically related.
Yeah, exactly.
So
exactly.
It would almost be like calling Elisha the son of Elijah, even if they're biologically unrelated. And here in the West, that doesn't make sense. You wouldn't say that they're related unless a formal process of adoption or something like that took place.
Exactly.
So sometimes the ancient rabbis and stuff would draw those types of connections and use kinship language without meaning to imply that they are biologically related.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
So I
And
don't know if
I almost,
if that could be this instance or
it could be. And my whole, my gradual response to that question was, it seems more midrashic than anything else,
right.
which is fine.
Oh, sure.
So as a result, it challenges those connections. Where is this going? How could this be connected to something else?
Mm-hmm.
So it was just really fascinating to do a lot of that research. And I got something to surprise you with.
I'm ready.
When we get into this first chapter. So
Okay.
Now you've got the living tree.
Yep.
Do you want to read your translation?
Sure. Do you want me to do the whole chapter or like verses 1 through 13?
So I'm curious, does the living tree put these into the pericopes of 1 through 7, 8 through 14, and 15 through 20?
No.
Does it basically have 3 sections? Okay.
No, it just has 12 through 13 and 14 through 20.
Oh, okay. Got it. All right. Well, go ahead.
Do you want me to do 1 through 6?
Sure.
Okay. The word of the Lord, or the word of Adonai came to Joel, the son of Pethuel. Hear this, elders, give ear, all inhabitants of the land. Has this ever happened in your days, or even in the days of your fathers? Tell your children about it, your children to their children to another generation. What the locust left, the swarming locust has eaten. And what the swarming locust left, the cankerworm has eaten. And what the cankerworm left, the caterpillar has eaten. Awake, drunkards, and weep. Wail, all you drinkers of wine, on account of sweet wine, for it is denied to your mouth. For a nation has invaded your land, vast, yes, without number. Its teeth are lion's teeth, with jaw teeth of a lioness.
Now, for the sake of our listeners, what we're going to be able to do here is pull in a lot what we've just done in our series of how to study the Bible.
Yes.
And so this is where this comes in. First of all, I get to do this with my buddy and partner, Matt Crosswhite in crime.
Whoop, whoop.
We get to enjoy doing this together. But we're going to have some conversations about this because in reading through some of the stuff that I found, one was that there's a great deal of focus on verse 4.
Yes.
And I mean a huge amount of focus. I was just kind of blown away of going, okay, is this an overfixation? And so, but one of the things I noticed was a lot of the tie-in into apocalyptic thinking.
Yes.
Now, my good buddy, you've got a lot of experience in reading a lot of this apocalyptic writing. Joel Rosenberg comes to mind, even with even just the name Joel. And so I was wondering if you could explain to us if there's what tie-ins there are with this verse that you know of into that type of
Specifically?
Study. Yeah, yeah. Do you know of any?
So let's apply our what we taught our audience before about the rule of first mention.
Yes. Absolutely.
So let's I'm pulling up on Blue Letter Bible, the app. I'm pulling up Joel chapter 1 verse 4 to see the first word for locust, the first time locust is mentioned in this translation or in this passage. That word, this is the first use of that word in the Hebrew. Gazaim. The second use of obviously the term changes, that's why it gets translated differently. But the second use is actually a kind of locust swarm, and it's the word arbe. And its first use in scripture is from the Exodus. from Exodus chapter 10.
Okay.
And all throughout chapter 10. So when verse 4 says, what the locust left, the swarming locust has eaten, in my translation, it reads that way in the English. Swarming locust is the one that harkens all the way back to the Exodus, to the plagues of Egypt, to the apocalyptic showdown between gods, between Yahweh versus Pharaoh and all of the gods of Egypt, and the devastation that the locusts that Yahweh sent did on the crops there. And this verse talking about how what these locusts left, the next round did, what they left behind, the next round destroyed, what they left behind, the next round destroyed, also harkens back, just that theme harkens back to the Exodus, because the locusts destroyed some, and then more different animals and more weather events came and destroyed more and more and more of the land of Egypt and of the crops. It was not total devastation in one round and the rest were just for the sake of it. It was getting deeper and deeper and deeper into devastation, with the idea that Pharaoh could repent at any point and it would stop. But he kept hardening his heart / God was hardening his heart, which is a great study into itself, God hardening Pharaoh's heart. But we'll do that another time.
Sure. But there is that. But would you agree that there was, with there being this 4 types, and the different levels that they're going through, that it's coming to a complete and total devastation?
Absolutely.
And destruction. I remember even, where was that? I was even reading how when I think it was Jerome. Yeah, it was Jerome on this, and that he was talking about how this not only was a complete destruction and devastation, but also how it facilitated disease, the death and decay, especially even of the creatures themselves, just put into the air this devastation of that it would not only just affect plants, but it would start to affect people and animals. And so it was so encompassing that such an event, especially for an agricultural society, would mean total and utter loss.
Absolutely. And this also, Joel is also pulling from Deuteronomy. So we just talked about the Exodus and the plagues. In Deuteronomy 28:38, God is laying out, in chapter 28, he's laying out if you don't abide by my statutes and keep my mitzvot, keep my rules, then these negative things will take place. And verse 38 there says, you shall carry much seed into the field and shall gather little, for the locust shall consume it. So there's another use of locust referencing negative or curse on Israel if they continue to walk away from God. And then in Judges chapters 6 verse 5 and then 7 verse 12, it's talking about different enemy armies and comparing them to swarms of locusts. So there's a lot of biblical precedent, and then throughout the Psalms there's more. Jeremiah, there's some. We could talk about the dating of Jeremiah and which one comes first. But
one portion that came to mind was Proverbs chapter 30. When you get into 24 through 28, 24 actually starts out, 4 things on the earth are small, nevertheless they are very wise. And it starts talking about small creatures. And he brings up locusts. And it says that the locusts who have no king, yet they all march out in ranks. And so it does have that militaristic thinking behind it. But in this case, I remember another one suggesting that with how it's being discussed here and who is bringing it about is God himself. He becomes a king of sorts over these kingless creatures. Now, there is one train of thought that this is a lot of metaphorical use, and yet there's even the other that says some of this can be quite literal, especially with how these insects behave. Which we can take that. I mean, crying out loud, part of my land has alfalfa on it, and hey, And if there's one thing that attracts from hay, it's grasshoppers. The grasshoppers around my property is just insane. And my cabbages are not, they're struggling right now. I mean, you look at them, you see all these holes of like, oh, nuts. So just being able to have this personal experience with these grasshoppers, I realized, man, if this is just what one element of these things can do, imagine what all four of these things would do.
Yes.
Now, let's take this one. Let's take this one area. So if these could be metaphorical for four different armies, what are your thoughts about that? Do you think that that's even a little bit more plausible, or could it be just insects?
I think it could be either one.
Yeah.
But there's so much overlap between the two. Like in the instances in the book of Judges where locusts are mentioned, it's talking about the enemy armies coming in, but coming in to do what? To enslave the people and steal their produce. So in that sense, you could read it literally as a locust army, or an army the size of a swarm of locusts coming in to eat the food. You remember the story of Gideon, where he's having to thresh grain down in a wine press so that the enemy couldn't find it. Because food and scarcity thereof was a huge part of being under enemy control. So it's almost synonymous, whether it's hopping bugs or enemy armies, the result is the same. So whether it's literal bugs or literal armies is almost not it's almost not the point. The point is God is prophesying devastation. Bad things are coming.
And so we've got the law of first use now. Kind of coin a phrase, which I'm sure I'm not the first one to say this, even playfully. The law of last use, Revelation 9.
Sure, but before we jump there, I'm gonna cut you off. You can take it to Revelation 9 in just a second, but there's a neat tie-in of so we've kind of covered the motif of locusts through the Old Testament, and then the New Testament starts with some rando who wears camel's hair and lives out in the wilderness. And
I was going to bring that up.
Eats locusts.
Right. And he does bring,
Which is very interesting, the theme of that, because this little grasshopper thing, this locust that has been the devourer through all of the Jewish history up till his part, itself is becoming the devoured.
Right.
It's a complete reversal.
Yes, it is. Which is why I think that Revelation 9:11 kind of ties into the first part of the devastation of it. Because then you get this new cycle start all over with John the Baptist. And that was the point I was going to make, was that because it kind of goes
sorry,
into
I stole it from you.
That's quite all right. It goes into the motif really of what even Paul gets into with the first Adam and the second Adam. You get Adam bringing in one thing and then Jesus bringing in another thing. And so you've got these, and we've seen this before, especially when you look into Jewish calendars and such. Time is circular. It's based off of seasons that take place. It's not so linear as we experience here in the United States.
Right.
And so as a result, you get this new beginning that takes place here after all of this, just very dark, devastating, catastrophic thinking regarding this one little creature, which when you read Revelation 9 and you're given more ideas as to what this creature and the reactions people would have towards that creature could be, you go, man, there's a reason why this creature is considered a pest by so many, especially farmers. I mean, it's been a pest for me, for crying out loud, trying to get them to stay off my cabbage. But if it's all right with you, I'd like to go ahead and read this in chapter 9 of Revelation.
Sure. You know, I'm always good with jumping to Revelation.
We can start in verse 1. It says that the fifth angel sounded his trumpet or shofar, And I saw a star that had fallen out of heaven onto the earth, and he was given the key to the shaft leading down to the abyss. He opened the shaft of the abyss, and there went up smoke from the shaft, like the smoke of a huge furnace. The sun was darkened, and the sky too, by the smoke of the shaft, from the shaft. Then out of the smoke onto the earth came locusts. I mean, all right, we're already getting this very ominous language, right? Very ominous language. But then it continues in getting more ominous, because not only do we have this environment, we've got the setting. Now let's bring on the creature. Let's see what it says.
And can I build the setting just a little bit more?
Please go right ahead.
In ancient Jewish apocalyptic literature, like First Enoch, the abyss is where the fallen angels or the watchers are locked up and kept for this day. So already into the Jewish mindset, when we read the term the pit or the abyss, we're thinking the realm of the really, really baddies. This is not just the grave or Sheol.
Right. Oh, yeah. And then reading this in conjunction with what we've already read with Joel, man, it really does make this verse 4. You can begin to see why so many people focus on verse 4.
Absolutely.
It makes even more sense, especially with how they go on to describe this. Oh, for crying out loud.
Yes.
So came locusts, and they were given power like the power of scorpions have on earth. I hate scorpions. I had a buddy who woke up one time with a scorpion in a sleeping bag, and what turned out it wasn't just one. He was covered in scorpions. It was just
I could have gone the rest of my life without knowing that. Thank you, Josiah.
You're welcome. But it gives you that kind of feeling, right? I mean, we know what scorpions are. Well, you're in Arizona. You're probably around them a little more than I am. But here's the kicker of what happens. They were instructed. So there is something at work here. There's something at play, and this is what I'm kind of leading into here in a minute. They were instructed not to harm the grass on the earth, any green plant, or any tree, but only the people. So in Joel, we get this contrast where it's going after the food. Now it's going after, but only the people who did not have the seal of God on their foreheads.
Right.
Okay. Well, the locusts were not allowed to kill them. Okay. Now we're hearkening back to Job, only to inflict pain on them for 5 months. Wonder how long Job was tortured.
We actually have no idea how long the book of Job takes, but the average lifespan of an ordinary locust is roughly 5 to 6 months.
I did not know that. Okay. That makes even more sense. For the entire lifetime of the locust, they were going to inflict pain. Okay. Interesting. Okay. Isn't amazing? This is amazing. And the pain they caused was like the pain of a scorpion sting. You ever been stung by a scorpion?
Thankfully not.
Amen to that. I haven't either. In those days, people will seek death, but will not find it. They will long to die, but death will elude them. Now, these locusts looked like horses outfitted for battle. Oy vey. On their heads were what looked like crowns of gold, and their faces were like human faces. They had hair like women's hair, and their teeth were like those of lions. Their chests were like iron breastplates, and the sound their wings made was like the roar of many horses and chariots rushing into battle. They had tails like those of scorpions with stings, and in their tails was their power to hurt people for 5 months. They had as king over them the angel of the abyss, whose name in Hebrew is Abaddon, and in our language, destroyer. Well, what that may be in Revelation, what I was reading really stuck out to me. Now, I know that back in when we talked about our commentaries and our study aids, I brought up the website My Jewish Learning.
Okay, yes.
Now, there's an article on there that I grabbed entitled Joel, Misplaced Prophet of the Locust Plague. And Michael Fishbane starts talking about various aspects of this book. I mean, he's got it broken into why the book of Joel is second in the order of the 12 minor prophets. So he has some very specific ideas on that. But he also says that he illustrates how there's at least two sections, right? Now, depending on whether you're reading the English or the Hebraic, or I guess we can put it that way, you either got 4 chapters or 3 chapters. Now, that can be another discussion that can be as long as we want, but he points out something very specific and intentional, that the first part portrays in terms of a natural disaster caused by a withdrawal of the divine presence. And that really, right there, that kind of struck me. We've got something very intentional going on with the land here, that as a result of God's presence being part and attached to the land of Judah and all of Israel, right? We discussed this. I brought this up once before, but a part of Jordan, there's a small little part there that apparently when the Israelites or any Israelites were in possession of that land, even in modern times, that little section of land could produce as much as I want to say this was, I almost think that this was an extreme, but this is the numbering that I read, can produce a third of the food that the world produces in just this one small area of land. But when the Palestinians took over, seeing, oh, here, we can get the breadbasket of the world, that land pretty much stopped producing. So it continues with this very literal attachment between the land and God and the people of Israel. So you've got this relationship that's being highlighted over and over and over again, that this land is God's given, that he's allowing to be used, basically rented, so to speak, taken ownership and stewardship of by Israel, and by their relationship with God ends up being reflected back on the land.
Right.
And then the land ends up becoming what the land is, and just because of the natural fall of things and just what the land will naturally produce. And as a result, you kind of get this veil pulled away of all of this blessing, of all of this fertile, this massive production of what God would have the land be like. We get this
exactly what Moses predicted in Deuteronomy 28.
Right. That's right. Yeah, you're right. I completely spaced that. You're absolutely right. And so as a result, you even get that even more specific point of even God, Moses saying, what are you going to choose, life or death? Because you choose life, the land's going to reflect that right. Death much more naturally than it will the life. Because when God leaves that land, what do you got left? You got pretty much a desert. And I remember reading something about an archaeologist back in the 1800s.
Okay.
Who said that he was in the late 1800s into the early 1900s. And so he had made a point in maybe the 1890s that Israel was pretty much inconsequential. I mean, it was just barren landscape. But when Israel came back into existence, that towards the end of his career and towards even the end of his life, he said, this is completely different. This is no longer just a barren land. There is some amazing things happening to this landscape. This isn't just something that would happen back in antiquity.
Right.
That lady that I mentioned before, who managed to revive a dead and extinct plant, all because these seeds were found in an archaeological site, and they thought, well, let's see if we can bring these seeds back. And now you're beginning to see these trees be replanted that have been gone for hundreds of years. It's amazing what happens when Israel actually takes over the land that they've been given, right?
Yeah.
Which makes me even more sad when, based on what you told me the other day about what happened and going on in Israel right now.
Yes.
The coup.
Yes.
But I want to go back, if you don't mind, to the second verse. Hear this, you leaders. Listen, all who live in the land. He's talking to everybody. Everybody. And he's using that language, hear this, listen. So we've got that parallelism that's taking place here. It's building on each other. Hear this, you leaders, listen, all who live in the land. And the word there, all, is even more kind of, okay, you're not just talking to the Israelites, you're even talking to even the God-fearers, the sojourner, and everybody.
Yeah.
And I don't know, it kind of put me into reading that and just thinking about that more and more. It kind of put me into this very contemplative state of asking myself, what would it be like if I was there? I'm not an Israelite, and I am watching everything taking place. I'm getting concerned over the needs and for myself and my family. And yet here is Israel dropping the ball. What ball would I have dropped had I been living there as a simple God-fearer? Would that be a responsibility to step up to my Hebrew neighbor and saying, hey, I thought God said to do this? Would that have been? And so it just creates this question for myself of what would have been my responsibility? What would have been my role in this taking place? And it was very sobering to think that, because you kind of, anybody and everybody anywhere has this ability to be basically detach themselves from a given situation. This climate stuff right now, and a lot of other things, a lot of problems we're having in the U.S. You're going, well, what fault of that is mine? What role do I have to play in that? And it's easy to pass the buck, but it's left me asking that question and being conscious of where my thinking was going. You know what I mean?
Absolutely.
So it may be one of the shortest books in the Bible, but I mean, it's amazing just how even dipping into this can just challenge so much of our own thinking that you go, okay, I wasn't seeing that. That was different.
And but, if you think, I mean, if we branch into politics just a little bit, biblical politics, you know, David reigned for quite a long time,
right?
Over just Judah and Benjamin, I think it was, and I think Simeon was kind of enveloped into Judah by the time David was there. But he reigned for years before the rest of the populace acknowledged him as king. And we can go on throughout the biblical narrative when Saul was not able to unite everybody. David finally was, and Solomon, David's son, ruled over a united kingdom. And then his son Rehoboam makes a really stupid decision when Solomon passes away, and all of the workers, both locals, who the law says you are not allowed to enslave your brothers and sisters and force them to do manual labor, but you are allowed to do that of slaves. Now, audience, please don't think the Atlantic slave trade, slavery in America was a very different thing at the time. It was employing foreigners to do the hard labor that you didn't want to do. That's biblical slavery.
Right.
It says nothing of beatings or mistreating people or anything of the sort. In fact, all of that is spoken very negatively against in Torah. But when all the folks came to Solomon and said, "Hey, your dad was pretty severe on us. Can you lighten the load?" He said, "No. My little finger is thicker than my father's thigh, and he scourged you with whips, and I will scourge you with scorpion tails." So he makes a bad decision, and the northern 10 tribes rebel. So my point in bringing all this up is for personal application. Like you said, it's easy to pass the buck and send it up the chain and just say all of our politicians did this, or even to say all the people that live in big cities did this and who they elected and stuff like that. But really, the fact of the political situation, just the way politics works, is those in power over the political system, whether ancient Israel or America or anywhere in Europe or whatever, through whatever portion of time, yes, it's often the wealthy and the mighty that are the rulers, but it also, to a significant degree, has to do with the populace allowing it.
Oh, yes. Very good point.
So
Very good
we
point.
might not have an active role in a lot of what's going on. Maybe we do, maybe we don't, but we definitely have a passive role, and not just, well, I voted for the other guy, so I'm exempt. No. Did you speak up against what's going on in our culture and our society? Not. And I'm not talking about brandishing arms or anything remotely like that. But did you practice your right to peaceful protest? Did you lovingly go to your neighbor and say, help me understand why you think this is okay? Because my Bible says it's not, and I want to hear your perspective, and let's have an honest conversation about it. I don't even necessarily want to call it a debate, but it will be a debate in the traditional sense of the word. You share your thoughts and ideologies in an intelligible way, and then respectfully listen as I share mine. And we poke holes in each other's thoughts and see which one floats and still holds water.
Oh my word. Okay, so as you're saying this, so we've already established that there's thinking that this is a lot very metaphorical.
Right.
So if we want to take that metaphorical and we want to run with it for a second, the verse 4 turns into something quite psychological in the process of human beings. And we see that in spades these days on the internet, especially YouTube. Somebody says this and they leave a thought. Somebody picks up that thought. They have their own idea on it. And then they just kind of leave that thought to just kind of pulsate. Somebody picks up that thought and then starts running with it. And we see this progression, much like we see the progression in verse 4 in the devastation that takes place. Now, you take that analogy and it does become a very depressing idea of thinking, wow, human behavior really is just completely devastating, which we already have seen that it is.
Of course.
So where's the hope in this? Now, we'll get into that in other episodes as we dig deeper into Joel. But if there's one thing that we see with the language, I'm going to shift this a little bit now. Sure. We're going to see something in the language is that even though there is this pronouncement of judgment, there's a lot of empathetic language going on here. Yeah. God isn't just simply cut off from his people. He is still being empathetic, even with the drunkard. Wake up, drunkards, and weep, wail, feel bad. All who drink wine, because the juice of the grape will be withheld from your mouth. He's thinking of how they're going to react based on what's about to happen. He's very aware of what it's going to be like. He sees beforehand what it's going to be. And so and you got a lot of this, and I don't want to jump into that yet, but I've got some grammatical stuff I want to bring here in a minute. But he's talking to the people. He's talking to the virgin in verse 8. I mean, he's going through the very stratas of society, and really the entire lifescape, as I would put it, of the Israelite and the inhabitant of that land, both from the leader to the average person. All of this, he's saying, I see you all. Yeah. Now I really need you to hear something. I really need you to listen to something. Because what is that word? It takes us back to the Shema. And what does that call us to? It calls us to an act of an action and doing something. He's really calling us to listen to him and obey him on a certain matter. And that's when we can turn to more of the grammatical usage of this. And that is, there is throughout this one chapter a lot of imperative language.
Now, do you want me to finish reading the rest of the chapter before?
Yes, let's do that. Thank you so much.
Okay.
Please.
So I'll pick up. We read through verse 6.
Mm-hmm.
So I'll read 7 all the way through 20.
Why not? Let's do it. Yes.
Okay. He has turned my vine to waste and my fig tree to splinters. He has stripped off all the bark and flung it down. Its branches are left white. Wail like a virgin dressed in sackcloth for the husband of her youth. Grain offering and drink offering are cut off from the house of the Lord. Kohanim, my Bible leaves some of the words in Hebrew. So the priests, the ministers of the Lord, mourn.
Right.
The field is ruined, the land grieves, for the grain has been devastated, new wine is dried up, oil languishes. Be ashamed, O plowmen, wail, O vine dressers, over wheat and over barley, for the harvest of the field is lost. The vine withered, the fig tree wilted, pomegranate, palm and apple tree, all trees of the field are withered, for joy has withered away from the children of men. Gird yourselves and wail, priests. Howl, ministers of the altar. Come, lie in sackcloth all night, ministers of my God. For grain and drink offering are withheld from the house of your God. Consecrate a fast. Proclaim a solemn assembly. Gather elders and all living in the land to the house of the Lord your God, and cry to the Lord. Ah, the day. The day of the Lord is near. As havoc from Shaddai, as havoc from the Lord, it will come. Is food not cut off before our eyes, joy and gladness from God's house? Seed has shriveled under the dirt clod. Storehouses are desolate. Granaries are torn down, for the grain has withered. How the animals groan, the herds of cattle are perplexed, because they have no pasture. The flocks of sheep also suffer. To you, Lord, I cry. For fire has devoured the pastures of the wilderness, and flame has set ablaze all the trees of the field. So beasts of the field pant toward you. For the water of the wadis is dried up, and fire has devoured the pastures of the wilderness.
Oh boy! Talk about heavy,
right?
Back to the Future, heavy. What does gravity have to do with this? There's that word again. Does something happen to the gravity in the future? Okay, not to get too far flung, but really, I think it's an appropriate word. That is some heavy language, very heavy language. Now, one thing I would note of why it's so heavy is that you've got a lot of noun verb phrases. Now, when you look at grammatically speaking from a grammatical perspective, now I get to go into the linguistic stuff for a second.
Go for it.
If you don't mind. Is that with this, you get a very active language approach. I'll even take an example out of my fantasy collection. I have an author, and her name is Jillian. She's got some really interesting stuff. Now, in her first book, she has a lot of noun and verb phrases. And so as a result, it makes the language, the narrative, very active based, right? Okay. Now, in her second book, she actually shifts from her style of writing from these very active approach narrative to a more reflective one by using complete sentences, if not more of a complex sentence structure. Excuse me. And so as a result, you get lost in the language. You kind of have this break in the narrative. And so when it comes to having such an active narrative, it really conjures images, it conjures actions, and you contribute it more to something very basic as much as just me moving my hand. It can become that much more personal. So when you start looking at the language, it's a reason why that's so personal, because when you look at the imperatives of this, especially in the first chapter, you get the imperatives of hear, listen, tell, wake up, wail, mourn in verse 8, despair, wail, grieve, put on, mourn, wail, come, stay, prepare, call, gather, cry out. There's a lot of personal action that's taking place here. And so what I was talking about earlier was going, what role is mine? Ooh, maybe there is something of a role in mine, in that now this God, regardless of whether I was making it personal or not before, God's making it personal for me now.
Right.
See my point? And so it just kind of makes you stop, kind of makes my own heart flutter in a way of going, okay, God, now this is getting a little too touchy. Because we've already talked about the political aspects, both biblical as well as now. And the now aspect of going, okay, now I can take this and I can try to find a way, and I'm sure there can be ways. Would you even say that there are ways that Joel could be read now that could be prophetic, in the sense of Joel was talking about what could be happening today? Do you think it could be that specific into its prophetic tie-ins?
Absolutely.
Okay.
Maybe next podcast or at some point in our Joel study, we talk about the day of the Lord.
Yeah, which is definitely a focus of this book, specifically is the day of the Lord.
And we already read a little bit about that's already referenced in the first chapter, but by and large, just brief overview of the way that I read scripture and specifically the prophets is that many of the prophecies have been fulfilled historically.
Yeah.
But also at the
agree.
exact same time refer to something still coming. Some of them have not been fulfilled, and so therefore very reasonably we would expect that they'll be fulfilled in the future. But also, kind of like what you said, as the Jewish perspective of history is cyclical. Some of these prophecies have been fulfilled multiple times, and there's still yet. We could also say it's being fulfilled today, and it might still be fulfilled in future at the great and terrible day of the Lord at the end. So So the short answer to your question is yes. Yes, I think it could be referring to today, and it could be referring to future still.
And I would venture to say that it goes to that because of just the overall behavior and psychology of human beings.
Right.
Now that's not an excuse, and that's not something to set down on, but it definitely you definitely have that at play going on here. I mean, it goes all the way back. I mean, we can take this all the way back, even some of the things I've mentioned earlier, to what Adam said about Eve. You gave her to me. It's your fault, God.
Yeah.
Talk about repositioning personal responsibility.
Yes.
Right? Here's God calling us to personal responsibility. And what we haven't yet found any response of Israel, but what we've seen though leading up to this is that response. Well, Adam's was, it's your fault, God, not mine. Not mine. And this kind of harkens. Every time I think of Moses, one of the things that pops up for me when it comes to Moses and his interaction with God is how is the language he uses concerning the people of Israel when he's talking to God. Your people. And he keeps kind of taking himself out of the lot of people and saying, no, these are your people. This isn't my problem. This is your problem.
And that actually, it's funny that you bring that up, because when Moses does that later in the Torah, like throughout Numbers and Deuteronomy and stuff, it actually harkens back to when God himself did that at Mount Sinai. Because starting in chapter 19, he is starting wedding proceedings with the people of Israel. And then the golden calf incident happens. And God flips the language from my people who I brought up out of Egypt. He flips it to Moses, go down to your people whom you brought up out of Egypt.
Yes.
Get out of my way. I'm going to destroy them, and I'm going to start over with you. So then later when Moses does the same thing, it's because he's doing the flip of what God himself did in order to communicate back to God. I'm feeling just as frustrated now as you were then.
Can we say God has no personality?
Right? Oh my goodness.
But you begin to see the relationship that's going on here. To take Joel out of its context, it's focused on Joel. We get to miss out. Do you
So
need
much.
context to read Joel? No, but does it help? Oh, the
You need
picture that it
context to
brings up.
understand all that Joel is doing and the references that he's making and the motifs that he's borrowing. Yes.
Absolutely. Oh, absolutely. So now I'm going to get to going back to grammatical. I'm going to get back to something that I think might excite you.
Okay.
Of the possibility of chiasms.
Is there a chiasm in here?
Could there be?
Oh, you better talk quickly. I'm getting excited. Sorry, my
All
nose
right.
is showing. Better tuck
Go
that
to
back
five,
in.
go to verse 5.
Yeah.
Wake up, drunkards, and weep. Wail, all you who drink wine, because the juice of the grape will be withheld from your mouth. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
What if we looked at that from a linguistic standpoint of prescriptive?
Sure.
Okay.
They're being told to do this. Yeah.
Yep. Now let's look at 6 and 7. For a mighty and numberless nation has invaded my land. His teeth are lion's teeth. His fangs are those of a lioness. He has reduced my vines to waste, my fig trees to splinters. He's plucked them bare, stripped the bark, and left their branches white.
Okay. Which
Would
is
you say that
also a
would be
reference kind of forward to 11 and 12.
Ah,
Is that where you're
could
going
that
with
be
this?
descriptive?
Be ashamed, plowmen, wail, vine dressers, over wheat and barley. For the harvest of the field is lost, the vine withered, past tense. Big tree withered, pomegranate palm, apple trees withered. Interesting.
So could there be a prescriptive and descriptive chiasm taking place here? And if that's the
Yes.
case, what could we get? We get our A's, we get the top and the bottom in
Yep.
verse 5 and verse 13 and 14. We get our B's in verse 6 through 7. And you said 11, 12 a minute ago, but you could see even some prescriptive language in verse 12.
Sure.
Steve's would be 8 and 11. So the D, the description in 9, 10 would be the focus of that chiasm.
It sure would. So let's read those two again. 9 and 10. Grain offering and drink offering are cut off from the house of the Lord. Priests, ministers of the Lord, mourn. The field is ruined, the land grieves, for the grain has been devastated. New wine is dried up, oil languishes. Now, in that occurrence, the wine and the oil is in reference to the sacrifices, not just the general supply of the land,
Right.
like it is in before and after this.
If there's one thing that's jumping out to me from these two verses, fellowship. Fellowship, because there's what we're talking about when you're going back into the language of even before this, especially even back all the way to Exodus, we've got the element of fellowship going on here. Fellowship is being established throughout, but now we see fellowship is being directly threatened.
Yes.
It's being directly threatened, whether it's through worship or whether it's through just the enjoyment. I mean, even King Solomon, when he's getting into his very depressing conversation of everything's so meaningless, he finds meaning with food, spouse, and others. Yep. So even he says fellowship is meaningful. It's where we get the meaningful out of all this meaningless.
Yeah.
So,
and as you're talking about this, I'm also seeing a connection, which like another thematic chiasm, which is a little bit more abstract, but with the same center. As we read through it, it started almost geographic. Think geographic. So it started wider out with the fields and the vineyards and fields and vineyards. We're talking acres. We're talking rolling hills and wider out. And then it moves toward the city center, toward the house of the Lord, the house of the Lord.
Right.
and then
Right.
at our center, and then it moves back out to the hills and the fields and the vineyards.
Exactly. That was the other point. Yes. Yes. Oh man. Yes. Yes. Right.
I'm so glad you caught that. That's awesome.
Because I mean, what's the focus? Even Joel gets into temple. So there's an aspect that there's an understanding going on that they understood what the temple was. It hadn't been destroyed, or at least the temple had at least come back. And so they've got this understanding of temple operation, right?
Absolutely.
And
No,
so
the temple had not been destroyed at this point.
no, and so here we go again of going more of what's the focus here? What's the focus of this land? Now we've got people enjoying it, right? We've got the people, and we can even go all the way back to the spies and their entire interaction with just seeing the land, and then their children and their actual use of the land. But when you get comfortable, let's go that way. When you finally start to get comfortable and you begin to get used to the practices that have been developed, you get the syncretism that comes out of Judges, and this amalgamation of trying to bring in other practices in order to practice this one thing. For example, the incorporation of altars into people's backyards, because come on, God, let's be reasonable. For me to travel 70 miles just to burn an animal on the altar that you have in front of your temple. I mean, I'm well intentioned here, God. Let's
Right.
let's be
I want to
let's
be
be
able
reasonable.
to sacrifice and worship you more often than that.
Right. And you get more and more complacent. You get more and more comfortable to the point where even God is looking at very specific people here. He's talking to the drunkard. He's talking to the virgin. And he even talks to the Kohanim.
And
which,
the plowmen and the vine dressers. And
exactly. This entire strata of societal, he's going to every single one. And these are focuses of that society. And these are also focuses that we see taking place back in the Exodus narrative.
Yes.
Right? And so everything's hearkening back to the Exodus narrative. It's hearkening back specifically even to the Torah itself. Which is
back
why
to the
I think
Exodus narrative of how he rescued them out, but also to the Exodus narrative of they were supposed to be a kingdom of priests to all of the nations. Meaning God was going to have a unique and special relationship with them, and then that was going to radiate light and quality of relationship, inviting the other nations into it.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So, you want one more chiasm?
Oh my gosh. You're going to break my brain. Yes. Do I want another chiasm?
So, we can look at the first chapter and even into chapter 2 as two sections itself. You got the lamentation over the ruin of the country from verses 1 through 12. And then you've got the day of the Lord is coming from verses 13 to 2:14. But let's look at the first one, verses 1 through 12.
Sorry.
Now,
chapter 2, verse 14.
Yeah.
Okay.
Now,
all right. And we'll get more into that next episode, but.
Right. Now, let me clarify something real quick. Now, when we go into chiasmic construction, we've talked about what that can look like. There can be similar language, A and B, B and C, so on and so forth. But when you look into what would be called a concentric structure, you can have a pericope that stands out. It's a portion of text that is specific to one topic or theme, right? And so if we take verses 1 through 12 as being a lament, and we go to, say, verses 2 through 4, what the cutter left, the locust swarm has eaten. Then we jump down to verses 9 through 12, and you can even read in 10 that the field is ravaged, the earth mourns. We begin to see some abstract connections start taking place. And so as a result, if we get this going on here throughout this pericope and we try to find a center to it, we can find that verses 2 through 4 can have some connection to 9 through 12, which would make 4 and 10 connected. 5 and 8 being the B connected. which would make a center of verses 6 through 7, which would make a focus of for a people has invaded my land. Now, this one's a little bit more abstract. It's a little bit more
destroyed it.
Technical. Yes, and destroyed it. It's a little bit more technical, but we're working off of a different type of grammar here. As I said earlier, it's a concentric pericope.
Okay.
So you've got a structure of language that's taking place here that's focusing around one specific thing. It is destruction. And as a result, we get verse 6. What's happening and what it causes. It's an invasion and it's going to destroy. And thus you have a constructive, parallel, pericope, chiasmic structure.
Say that 10 times fast.
I know. It's highly technical. And to be honest with you, I still struggle with this part of linguistics because I got my degree a long time ago. And so I still need a little help every now and then. But it's amazing what language ends up doing when we start looking at it, even in this light. We get more of this focus of what our eyes are trying to be drawn to. Right?
That's awesome.
And so we've got that focus earlier of 9 through 10, loss of fellowship. But what's the purpose of everything else? What's the purpose of this lament? It's to draw the eyes to the fact that, hey, something's changing with our responsibility to this land, to the ownership of this land. And what's going to happen as a result? Complete, total devastation. Complete and total. And and as a result, you get this very hopeless idea of everything going on. Everything's lost. Everything's meaningless at this point. But then, as we'll find as we go farther into Joel, hope is restored. Right? And that's why we get to see this empathetic language going out there. And this, not just empathetic language, but this empathetic call.
Right.
It's this call. And this is, so the day of Adonai thus creates this question for me. Is it negative or is it positive? Sure, we can definitely see the negative for sure. We can definitely see the negative. But can we also begin to see the positive?
Yeah.
Right? In order, I mean, this is kind of, I guess it's kind of cliche and kind of trite, but you have to hit rock bottom before you can finally start going up, right? In some sense. But it kind of goes to that a little bit. I find all this to be highly personal for me. Sure. Just simply because of my own walk with God and what it and the challenges that it's had over the years. But suffice it to say that I know that for me growing up, reading this type of language was a struggle because I was always left to think, okay, despair you farmers, lament vine dressers. Okay, so they're using specific people. There's got to be some very deep meaning to that, right? And you get into this hyperactive sort of approach to scripture of going, okay, there's something so mysterious going on here that I have to understand that very word and what it's trying to say. You see what I'm saying?
Yeah.
It doesn't. We don't have to work so hard to try to understand what the Bible's saying. We don't have to work so hard. We can let the language just speak.
Right. Absolutely.
So,
and with that, I think perhaps we close this episode and we'll jump into Joel chapter 2 next week. What do you say?
Let's do it.
All right. So as always, we would love to hear from you, our listening audience. Please, please, please write to us, beardedbiblebrothers@gmail.com. Tell us your thoughts about Joel, about locusts, about chiasms, about Josiah's beard, about whatever it is that you'd like to comment on. We'd love to hear from you. beardedbiblebrothers@gmail.com. And until next episode, happy studying.